It's easy to read the parable of the rich man and Lazarus as a sort of morality tale, a straightforward story of how the humble who suffer receive good in the end, while the powerful find themselves left to pain and regret. Others might see it as a lesson regarding riches and the importance of generosity. While those are certainly conclusions people can draw from the text, the narrative is far deeper than that. At its core, this is a tale about belonging. But before we get to that, we do need to consider a few things. First, we need to break out of our standard currency-driven economic mindset, where possessions are simply consumables. We generally think of the things that we own or use in terms of money, how expensive a particular item was. The objects themselves, our possessions, don't frequently hold anything beyond monetary value for us or anyone else. So once we're done with them, we simply toss them aside and move on to the next thing that catches our interest. The ancient world did use money, but money wasn't necessarily a person's everyday form of trade. That would have been bartering, which is something personally I hate doing. With bartering, it's the object itself that possesses the value. The concern becomes less about how much the thing costs and more about how useful the item is. Rather than simply being a possession, something a person owns and then over time no longer cares about. Everything functions as a resource, either due to the ongoing need for its utility or the value that utility might hold for another person when making an exchange. Looking back over our summer gospel readings, thinking of possessions in terms of resources can offer some clarity about what Jesus has been saying. The warnings he's been giving us often seem to point toward continuing to use, share, and maintain the actual value aspect of the resource, its usefulness, rather than simply allowing it to fall into the category of stuff, like our culture teaches us to do. Secondly, there is a common teaching among modern American evangelicals that the rich man and Lazarus isn't simply a parable. They'll tell you that it's literal, meaning that Jesus is giving us a factual glimpse into what the afterlife looks like and how it truly works. The only argument for that teaching is that, unlike anywhere else in the Gospels, Jesus has given one of these characters a name. While that particular detail is true, the rest of the idea is raw fantasy. The only way for this parable to be literal is if the world beyond is literally structured the way the Greco-Roman public imagined it to be, and that a literal ancient God literally manages it. If any of those variables are inaccurate, then this parable can only be what it actually is. A story Jesus is using to challenge our thinking and hoping will alter our behavior in this life. Moving forward, Jesus introduces his story describing a man who was rich. To us, that term is just a reference to money or wealth, the physical manifestations of power and authority we like to collect in order to command a certain measure of control or certainty in our lives. But for Jesus, saying the word rich involves invoking the name of a god. The literal translation of what we see here is that this person was a Plutonian man, or a man of Pluto. Pluto was the ancient Greek god of wealth. The Romans also recognized him as such, but because humans mine riches from the ground, Pluto also doubled as their equivalent of Hades, the god of the underworld. The grammatical structure of man of Pluto is similar to what we translate as child of God. While the term is a description of the person, it's also a subtle statement of to whom that person belongs. So the rich man, a man of Pluto, not only enjoys the blessings Pluto provides in this life, but is, in a sense, one of Pluto's own possessions, or resources, as we talked about earlier. Recognizing that can help explain the weird little poetic contrast about Lazarus dying and being carried away to be with Abraham, while the next sentence, the rich man also died and was buried, feels so flat. As a child of Abraham, it makes sense for Lazarus to go to join his ancestor's household. The Plutonian man also goes to be with his master, which means he's simply dumped back into the ground where all of Pluto's treasures rest. Having finally reached his home, he too will continue to enjoy the blessings of the God that he served so well throughout his life. The problem arises when Hades, Pluto's realm, doesn't quite match the rich man's expectations. Now, it's important to recognize that Hades is not a direct equivalent to our modern concept of hell. In fact, our later theologies influence quite a few aspects of the translation that we read. Our idea of hell, the place where sinners go when they die, is largely based on two things: the lake of fire, mentioned in the book of Revelation, and Jesus' own metaphor he used of Gehenna, the wasteland where all of Jerusalem had been burning its trash throughout generations. Hades, on the other hand, was a realm for all the dead, and therefore wasn't entirely a place of torture. Like any city, it had both its nicer and less desirable neighborhoods. And it wasn't necessarily a fun place to be. Imagine the best views in the city overlooking a foggy, featureless plain without even a hint of a breeze. So, not great, but not everyone there was in agony. Wherever within that city he had ended up, the rich man was not particularly happy with his lot. It seems he still had access to everything that Pluto had ever offered him. It's just that the true form of these riches, the formal reality behind the physical objects he had known, didn't entirely match his earthly memory of them. We read Jesus describe him as being tormented, but that isn't actually quite what the text says. Jesus has framed that particular phrase in the exact same way that he talks about possessions. The rich man still has plenty of resources, but now all those resources feel like tortures or testings or examinations. The word Luke uses suggests the idea of intense scrutiny or interrogation. So, unlike when he was alive and everyone had to answer to him, now, in the direct presence of Pluto's watchful eye, his every move is under review and needs to be accounted for. Yet the man doesn't seem to realize what's going on. His interaction with Abraham reveals that he still thinks of himself as the one with power and authority. He's polite enough with his Abrahamic ancestor at first, but he still clearly views Lazarus as an inferior. Father Abraham, I'm struggling ever so warm in this stagnant atmosphere. Why don't you go and dispatch that Lazarus with a dab of water to refresh my tongue? Abraham politely rebuffs the request, responding that Lazarus is now comforting himself, while the Plutonian is afflicting himself. But there's a double meaning in how Abraham describes Lazarus here. Comforting is also the word for summoning. So it isn't simply that after a hard life, Lazarus finally gets to rest. He now has the wherewithal to do the summoning and the dispatching. The rich man has no authority whatsoever to tell him, or Abraham, what to do. But the rich man still doesn't get it, replying, "Fine, Dad, then make him go and tell my family that the afterlife with Pluto isn't as great as we thought." So much micromanaging. However, sufficiently resourced with what for him has become torment and facing rejection once again, there is no indication in this text that he ever recognizes that he isn't in charge. And it's likely that he will never come to that conclusion. He'll just spend the rest of time frustrating himself, tortured with constant nitpicking and oversight and audits, while having to reinspect and continually manage the accounting of Pluto's treasures in their true form. When we began, I described this parable as a tale of belonging. What I meant is that this is actually a story about families and households. And, like the slave trying to serve two masters last week, a warning to consider to whom we truly belong. Lazarus has a single identity throughout the narrative. Whether through fault or accident, he's just an extremely poor child of Abraham. His life may not have amounted to much, but he knew who his family was, and that family was happy to claim him in the end. The rich man, however, holds a split identity. He self-identifies as the child of Abraham, 3 times calling him father. But everyone else recognizes him as a man of wealth, a man of Pluto. The question comes down to with whom does he actually belong? With which family was his life more concerned? A child of Abraham huddles outside the wall, starving, while the Plutonian feasts with other men of wealth. One of Abraham's children, in pain and misery, crouches beside the gate, constantly wakened and wearied by dogs licking his wounds, while the rich man rests quietly on cedar couches and naps on feather beds. With Abraham's child sprawled, dying at the door, the rich man squanders food and, like his father in Hades, secrets away his resources as if in a cave, hoarding and protecting possessions he would probably never use and likely didn't even know that he still had. Even after death, a child of Abraham would see and support their siblings. Children of Abraham comfort and provide for their family. Each of Abraham's descendants thinks to seek their siblings' good. Abraham's child will follow their father, honoring and serving both family and stranger alike. What then of us, who imagine ourselves not only to be descendants of Abraham, but children and images of God? How might we account for our choices and actions throughout this life? We cannot help but reflect the nature of the one whom we worship. So, with which family does our present behavior reveal that we belong? And if we don't like that answer, what can you do to change? Amen.